Afternoon. Wonderful to be here with you. I wonder if any of you chose to study at Oxford so that you could change the world one day. Did you? Perhaps you look around in college and think, are any of these people going to run the world or run it into the ground? So many people in history have done that. If you wanted to change the world, wouldn't Oxford be a good place to do it? So just think for a moment, what would you need in order to change the world forever? To leave your mark on it, to be studied, to be talked about, even revered, to be significant in millions of people's lives centuries after you died. That's the question behind our topic this lunchtime. Because we're thinking about Jesus of Nazareth, the most influential human the world has ever known. His name is on billions of lips every day. He's left a mark on every kind of person, on every continent, in every sphere of life. So who was he? Well, there is no shortage of opinions when it comes to Jesus. Christians like me will tell you that we worship Jesus as the Son of God. Others will say that Jesus was just a good moral teacher. Muslims will tell you about Isa, a prophet of Allah who never claimed to be the Son of God. And others, like Dan Brown, sniff a conspiracy theory. He wrote now quite an old book called The Da Vinci Code. And he was saying that we can't really get to the bottom of the real Jesus. Over the centuries, powerful organizations have sifted through the material. And what we're left with is the more official, disappointing version. Or even if it's not that sinister, others would say that over the centuries, stories about Jesus have been told and retold and traded around until you just don't know if you can trust them. So which presentation of Jesus is right? And how can we know? I was an atheist in my teens, and I remember doubting everything I was told about Jesus, viewing him the way you might view Zeus or Thor, as a myth. I wouldn't have been alone in doing that. A recent survey shows that 40% of adults in the UK think that Jesus wasn't a historical figure. What I found fascinating, and what had to challenge me, is that no serious historian actually takes that view. There's too much evidence of Jesus' impact on history to dismiss his existence. And so within 100 years of Jesus' life, you have people like Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Flavius Josephus, and Suetonius, who are giving us information about him. Now, these are hostile witnesses. They were not fond of the Christian movement they saw growing explosively around them. In fact, Pliny the Younger was writing to the Emperor Trajan to see how severely he could punish early Christians. And yet from their writings we can glean a lot of details. That Jesus was a teacher, one recorded as doing miraculous works. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, even that he was being worshipped as a god. It's noteworthy that it never occurred to the earliest opponents of Christianity to doubt Jesus' historical existence. That was a given for them. Also interesting that they never deny his supernatural abilities. They view his power as malign, but they recognize it nonetheless. Now, a far more detailed portrait of Jesus emerges in the Christian writings of the first century, which we call the New Testament. But should we take it seriously? Some of us are really wary of believing what the New Testament says. For one thing, aren't these accounts written many centuries after the events they describe? That was once the dominant academic view, that the New Testament was formed over many, many years, that there were centuries between the historical Jesus and what we can read about him in the Bible. And it is true that our first physical Bible texts, the full thing all put together, are found in 4th century codices. That leaves something like 300 years between Jesus' crucifixion and our first Bible written about him. And in that 300 years, so the logic goes, any number of mythical traditions might have sprung up about Jesus. But there's a problem with that theory. It is true that our first full texts of the Bible date from the 4th century, but we have many manuscripts and fragments of papyrus from before then. In the past 150 years or so, a whole academic discipline of manuscript criticism has emerged. Scholars with all kinds of religious convictions or none have spent decades researching what archaeological findings have unearthed. And as a result, we simply have to abandon the idea that these writings about Jesus are late fabrications. Let me take you to our earliest physical fragment of the New Testament. It's called Papyrus 52, a catchy name, and you can see it in the Rylands Library in Manchester. Through paleographical study, it's dated somewhere in the mid-2nd century. That's only a few decades after people believed that John itself was written. And that's hugely impressive. For one thing, scholars used to think that John's Gospel was written many centuries later. But nobody thinks that now. In fact, when we look at the New Testament, we have an embarrassment of riches. When we investigate the ancient world, a key part of the evidence is manuscripts. But they're very hard to find because papyrus is incredibly fragile, so it very rarely survives all these years, and they were very expensive to produce in the first place. A table like this one shows how rare they actually are to find. Now, when it comes to ancient history, we normally find two things. One, there's a massive gap between these texts being written and our first physical copy of them. Hundreds of years pass between them. Secondly, there aren't many copies of these texts for us to test and probe. So if anything had been changed, we would have no way of knowing. Now, that doesn't usually trouble historians of the ancient world. They understand the nature of the evidence left to us. But with the New Testament, we're in a totally different position. The gap between the texts being written and our first copies is comparatively minuscule. And the number of copies on offer to look at is massive. So we can probe and test with many sources at our disposal. In fact, because we have all these copies, we can be very confident that what we have is what they wrote. Because as you study manuscript criticism, you can see the chain of transmission of these manuscripts. And as you do, you can see the little discrepancies that are there. That's to be expected. If all of us here were to copy out the New Testament by hand, there would be discrepancies between what we wrote. But the vast majority of them are grammatical, things like word order. And in fact, even the most critical scholarly voices admit that in all the manuscript criticism we've done, not one claim about the Christian faith has had to change. Not one teaching about the person of Jesus has had to be altered. Now, all of that doesn't automatically mean it's true, but it does mean that these are reliable historical sources. Scholars date the Gospels to within 40 to 60 years of the events they describe, well within living memory. Earlier still are the letters of Paul, his first one dated to about 48 AD, just 15 years after the events of Jesus' life. Now, at this point, it's worth talking about the other Gospels that people often think about. Dan Brown made them a plot vehicle for some of his novels, and they are a bit of a tabloid favorite. From time to time, people will say that these Gospels advance a more plausible portrait of Jesus, and that in the competing manuscripts out there, these should take priority. It's a tempting claim, but again, it's problematic. Even the very earliest one of those other Gospels, so-called Gnostic Gospels, even the very earliest still comes from the late 2nd century, and all the others later than that. There's no shady conspiracy here. They weren't included because of history. But the texts that we do have were all written well within living memory. The gap between the things Jesus said and did and these writings is tiny. There isn't a big enough gap for myth-making. You may not remember what you were doing 15 years ago, but I know I do. And there are plenty of people around who can bear witness to what happened. That space of time is not long enough to come up with a huge mythical figure and then get lots of people to believe in him. The New Testament documents are the earliest sources we have about Jesus. No serious historian can dismiss them. We have what they wrote. But is what was written worth taking seriously? Well, here's the next thing I found as I investigated these texts. These writers claim to report what people saw, heard, and experienced. That's a big claim, but it's testable. Unlike a fairy tale, which begins with the words "once upon a time," the writers of the New Testament claim to write what they experienced and saw. They litter their writings with the names of places and people and all kinds of details that can be scrutinized. Other religious texts do not share that feature. That isn't what they're interested. But the New Testament offers that kind of reportage. And there are lots of ways you can test it. Archaeology is one way. In John's Gospel, Jesus goes to the pool of Bethesda to heal someone who's lame. And for many centuries, people scoffed at that. They'd never found a pool with colonnades like that at the Sheep Gate in Jerusalem. And yet, archaeologists uncovered it in the late 19th century. There are many examples of that happening. Now, we need to explain this somehow. If the New Testament writers aren't telling the truth, how do they keep getting it right? How do they keep giving us little details and touches that only eyewitnesses could have had, unless they were? In that example from John's Gospel, we know Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. So how does he grasp the layout of the city unless he was there? Now, at this point, we might be thinking, okay, so these Christians were writing early, and we have what they wrote, but why should we believe them? Won't they be deeply biased? Well, anyone who's a historian here will know that there's no such thing as unbiased history. No recording of history can ever be neutral. But actually, the fact that early Christians were biased is part of what makes them such excellent historical evidence. See, what we normally find is that history is written by the winners. The people on the right side of history, with the money, who won the battles, they control the narrative. They can set the agenda. History written by the winners. But when you read the earliest Christian writings, you're reading history written by the losers. Their message was deeply unpopular. In the Jewish nation in which it was born, people were hostile to this upstart messianic cult. The Roman Empire in which it grew became more and more violent in its suppression of this movement. See, what you have when you read these writings is the testimony of people who had nothing to gain by writing what they wrote and everything to lose, even their lives, for standing by what they said. This is history written by the losers. We need to ask, why would you make this up when it costs so much to stand by these claims? We are horrified when politicians have abused their power and privilege to assert falsehoods. We are right to question their agendas and to be skeptical. But we need to see that the early Christians had none of the power, none of the influence, none of the vested interests. They were a despised minority with no power or privilege from which to proclaim their message. And yet something about Jesus meant that they did. What was it? Ultimately, we need to make sense of Jesus to understand the most significant person in history. And here's what you find when you investigate Jesus. You find a person unlike any other. You find a person who drew huge crowds with thousands of people desperate to see and hear what he could do. And yet he wasn't a showman or entertainer or charlatan. He was prepared to tell the truth even when it lost him followers. You find a person who taught like no other teacher. His words have permeated cultures, shaped ethical systems. Even professed unbelievers point to Jesus as exemplifying the highest and best human ideals. And yet, it wasn't just talk with Jesus. You find a person who was no hypocrite. He once told his followers to forgive their enemies. And when his enemies were nailing him to a cross, he's recorded as saying, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Total integrity. You find a person who treated others in the most amazing way. Jesus broke down boundaries everywhere he went. In a time of massive sexism, you find him calling women to follow him, making them a key part of his message. In a time of massive inequality and a judgmental society, you find Jesus welcoming the outcast and rejected. He didn't suck up to the rich and powerful. He didn't look down on the poor and unimportant. He had time for the old and the young, for the healthy and the sick. It might be tempting to think that Jesus was just ahead of the game, a sparkling proto-example of our modern social justice movements. And yet, as we were thinking yesterday, we owe so many of those values to him. I'm not embarrassed of any part of his life. It's beautiful in a way that no other life has ever been. And yet, as well as beauty, others saw blasphemy. At least, blasphemy if his claims weren't true. Because you see Jesus receiving worship, which only God is supposed to get, speaking with the kind of authority no mere human could ever have. That's why calling Jesus just a good man or moral teacher is so unconvincing. Good people, moral teachers, don't say and do the things Jesus said and did. They just wouldn't make claims that arrogant, not without being deluded or dishonest, neither of which are fitting descriptions for the Jesus we find in history. Earlier, I asked what you would have to do in order to leave an impact on history. What would you need? Well, no one's left the impact on history Jesus has. We even measure time around his life. So here's what he had in order to leave that impact. Here were Jesus' raw ingredients. Only 3 years in the public eye. 12 haphazard and incompetent followers, one of whom betrayed him. Not an amazing city of influence like Oxford to move around in, but the unpromising Galilean backwaters. No money to spend. No armies to fight for him. And the climax of it all, a public, shameful execution. That's all Jesus had to work with. And with just that, Jesus began a movement that's growing at a staggering rate even today, such that 2 billion people, and counting, seriously call this homeless carpenter's son God. How do you explain it? Every thinking person should assess this evidence, because there's more than history to examine here. Follow Jesus through Mark's gospel, and you'll see him claim authority over nature, which only God as creator could have. You'll see him forgiving sins, which people around him will point out quite reasonably only God can do. You'll see him say that our response to him is what will make the difference at the very end of time. Jesus' claim is that when we look at him, we see what God is really like. And the God we see in Jesus is not like anything we might have imagined. You might have thought that God was distant and aloof from the world that he made, absent from its sufferings. But in Jesus, you see a God who steps in as one of us, is moved by love to come to us, who looks at our world and says, I want to make your home my home. I want to make your problems my problems. You might think that God is an egomaniac to put Donald Trump to shame. And yet, when you look at Jesus, you see a God so full of love that he steps down, who comes to his world not in a chariot, but in a crib, who doesn't take the side of the elite and the powerful, but comes as one of the oppressed and the weak, doesn't surround himself with servants, but chose the life of a refugee. In one moment, Jesus gives himself a title with royal connotations, the Son of Man. And then he says the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. In fact, when you look at Jesus, you see that God doesn't really want your good behavior or your religious observance. He wants you. And so he doesn't give you a religious rule book or a lifestyle guide, or even weird coincidences and freaky messages in the clouds. He gives you himself. He comes to offer real hope, real love, real security in a dark, cynical, fragile world. And Jesus claimed, and his earliest followers claimed, that his death and resurrection were what made that possible. Now, that might sound ridiculous to you today, but it sounded even more ridiculous back then. And yet, this man's claim took hold of history, turned the Roman Empire upside down, changed history forever, and is changing people today. Tomorrow, we're zooming in on the most audacious claim of Jesus, that he rose from the dead. So please come back and think through the evidence for that. But when we look at Jesus, we see an undeniable global impact, a life unlike any other. That's what history tells us. So what do you think happened? Why not see for yourself? Because these are claims that you can test. On your way out, take away a Gospel of Mark that should be near you on your seat. See for yourself, get to the bottom of it. Because what we read about when we read about Jesus is not less than history. But wonderfully, it is more. What's on offer in Jesus is nothing less than a relationship with the God who made you and loves you. So looking into this, you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. That is worth careful investigation. That's worth digging into. And if you'd like to find out more, I'll be sticking around at the end to talk to you about any questions you might have. Well, thanks so much for listening to me. There have been numbers up to text on the screen behind me, so do get texting with that, and then we'll have questions in a moment. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Niv. We're just going to have a time for some questions now that have already been texted in. So do you want to ask the first one? And keep texting in questions if you've got some.
Great. Okay, so our first question is, if the historical evidence is so compelling, why do you think many scholars who have dedicated their life's work to these documents remain unconvinced by the claims of Christianity? So there's quite a few questions like this, basically. Why would there still be scholars who don't believe?
Fantastic question. If the historical evidence is so compelling, why do so many scholars who study this for their whole lives not find the claims of the historical Jesus compelling enough to believe? Thank you. It's a brilliant question. I think the first thing I want to point out is it is those very scholars who tell us that this is compelling, this historical evidence, and that's really important to understand. What happens next is what you do with that historical evidence. I presume you came to Oxford to think, and perhaps even to learn how to think, and that's how life works. The evidence is there. Great study and care must be taken in understanding it, but a big part of that is interpretation. How will you interpret this evidence for yourself? And what I've been trying to do this lunchtime is maybe share a bit of how I found myself having to interpret the evidence. I'll do even more of that tomorrow. But the thing you notice with Jesus is that he doesn't confront you like any other figure in history. His words almost leap off the page in making claims about himself that are massive and in making claims about you that are massive. And the thing is, those claims are so offensive to our sense of self-control, to our sense of self-righteousness, to the way that we might want to live our lives. They're difficult to take on board. If it's true that Jesus died and rose again and is currently the king of the entire universe, then a logical implication of that is that he ought to be in charge of my life and of the choices I make, and that nothing would be too difficult for him to ask me to do. And that is an unpalatable prospect. If you've ever been let down by someone, that feels like a very difficult thing to say yes to. Now, I do not want to pretend for a moment that I can account for every individual scholar's agenda or argument or motives, and I don't mean to do that at all. But what I'm trying to say is that when we look at Jesus, we are playing with fire. We're cooking with gas. Insert whatever cliche you like. We're thinking about something live, something that implicates us. And that's why these lunchtimes are so precious, because it's a chance for us to do that together. I'm so grateful for your questions. But we are all implicated in this. What response will we make? What response will you make? It's up to those scholars to justify the motivation that's led them to say they're not convinced by the historical Jesus. I want to say there are plenty of theological scholars and historians who are convinced by those claims, both at a historical and an existential level. But what about you? Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you, Niv. The next question is, how do we know the disciples didn't just wildly exaggerate what Jesus did in their writings to make him seem more impressive?
Thank you. How do we know they didn't wildly exaggerate what Jesus did in their writings to make him seem more impressive? So many things to say on that, and thank you for that question. It's very well put. The first thing to say is that if they were meant to do that, they did a terrible job. One of the things that Christians will have to stand by from the very beginning of the Christian faith to the very end is the idea that Jesus was crucified and that was a good thing. One of our earliest writers, I mentioned him earlier, Paul, talks about the cross as being something that causes shame, something that looks weak and foolish. So if they were trying to exaggerate Jesus to make him seem more impressive, they did a terrible job, because they ended up creating a message that was so countercultural that any time someone shared it, people laughed at it. Do you know what the first image of Jesus is? It's a little piece of graffiti from the Roman Empire, and it's got a man kneeling down, and then it's got a cross with a man on it with a donkey's head. And it's got the caption, Alexamenos worships his God. It's the first image we have of Jesus, and it's fitting, because the testimony we have to Jesus is anchored in this moment of shame and humiliation. So if they were going to exaggerate, a good question to ask is, why on earth didn't they do a better job? Another thing to mention is, they stood by these claims even when it cost them everything. And we'll think more about this tomorrow. But that really lends everything they say serious credibility. These are not claims they just said down the pub and then walked back. These are not claims that they published anonymously on Wikipedia. These were things that they stood by, even when it cost them everything. And as I say, tomorrow we'll have a really good in-depth look at just one moment of them doing that. So I think that's a good enough reason not to doubt that they wildly exaggerated. There are many more things I could say. They come off terribly in these texts. If you were writing an account of something that happened to you, would you not want to look at least respectable at the very end? But they look dreadful, make all sorts of mistakes, barely get it. Why on earth would they record things like that? It's worth thinking about, and again, tomorrow we'll have a worked example of some of that. So if that was your question, please do come back. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Niv. Right, so someone here is saying, even if this is true, why do I need this relationship with God? What if I'm happy as I am? And can you back it up with anything Jesus actually said?
Can I back what up?
Back up the need for a relationship with God.
Great. With anything Jesus actually said. Sure, I mean, well, where to begin? If you were here yesterday, there's an amazing question Jesus asks, which I think everyone in the world needs to take on board. The question, what does it profit a person to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? A huge question. That's Jesus saying that however good your life is now, two things. One, it could be better if you knew the God who gave you those good gifts. And secondly, your grip on those things is very fragile. And any one of those things could disappear overnight. One of the reasons why I'm glad to be here this week is over the weekend, my wife was in a really serious car accident and miraculously unharmed. And I promise I'll stop talking about it, but I just want to say that's the kind of world we live in. She did not predict that happening. Neither did I. That's the kind of world we live in. And I'm desperate for you guys to hear something worth knowing about reality when those situations come your way. And on Thursday, we'll think a lot more about that. But for me, that's, I could keep going with all of the things that Jesus says, but he comes to call us to the life we were made to have. Why do you need this? Well, the truth is not easy to hear, but two things. One, because even as happy as you are now, that's still a dim reflection of the joy that's in the God who made you. And secondly, as happy as you are now, the world we live in is a fragile and difficult and dangerous place. And to put your happiness in temporary things is ultimately to put them somewhere unsafe and insecure. I could keep answering that. Another answer would be because there is life after death. And again, come back tomorrow to see why I believe that's true. But if that's true, then that means we give an account for the lives we live. That's a good thing. It means that justice isn't a silly game we're playing. It means that what wrong has been done will be put right. But it also means that if we spend our lives acting as if the God who made us and has paved our lives with all sorts of good things isn't there, then we have to give an account for that too. And he's not a churlish God. Banish from your mind the ideas that he's going to, blast us into oblivion with anger, but he is a just God, just with the kind of justice we cry out for when we see wrongdoing in our world. And that's one of the big things that Jesus says he's come to address. Thank you. Great question.
The next one says, why do the gospel accounts cover so much of the same material but with discrepancies? Wouldn't we expect reliable, independent accounts to cover different material but with no conflicts?
Thank you. Another good question. Wouldn't we expect independent, diverse accounts to cover the same material but without conflict? Actually, no. You wouldn't. If you had lots of different accounts which said completely the same thing, you would 100% suspect that something was going on. So actually, the way history works is not like that. We have two different accounts of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, and they're not particularly easy to harmonize. Do we conclude it didn't happen? No. Historians conclude all the more that it must have happened, because these two different perspectives give us slightly different outlooks. Why do three of the Gospels say such similar things? And because it's worth saying the fourth one that I quoted in my talk, John, that says very different things and seems to have been written to complement these other three. Why do they say such similar things? It's a good question. I think it seems to be because these writings themselves show an awareness of a process of recording of these Gospels that's happening in the first century. That there are plenty of eyewitnesses and sources out there that are being collated and brought together. And so Mark, which many scholars put as the earliest, is something that Matthew and Luke appear to have with them as they're putting together their sources. Now, that's not illegitimate. It's part of them putting forward a presentation of these events. And I don't think that's a problem at all. It's part of their perspective to add something different or show a different angle. And because you have those multiple perspectives, I think you have something far more credible. Final thing to say, and I want to say this is a little bit of a challenge, so it's a little bit sharp, but we need to figure out what we think the New Testament writers were. Are they clueless idiots always making mistakes? Or are they genius conspiracy theorists who managed to buck all the trends and get their work publicized and out there, even when it cost them everything? Because it can't be both at the same time. And that seems to be where some of these arguments land. Either, well, at the same time, they seem to be clueless and making all these amateur errors, but also at the same time, incredibly skillful at getting behind the story and putting out their agenda. Pick one, or in my opinion, pick neither. What you have is the experience of people honestly trying to recount what they saw, heard, and experienced. Thank you.
Thanks, Niv. Our next question is, how can we say that Jesus came to break down boundaries if he sets up another barrier, Christian and non-Christian? And if someone grew up in a Christian home, wouldn't it be easier to accept Christ?
Wonderful. Two questions there, both very good. How can we say Jesus came to break down boundaries when he sets one up, Christian and non-Christian? What a well-put question. I think the kind of boundary that Jesus preserves is ultimately the kind of boundary that every relationship has. No relationship can compel you to stay in it. That would be abusive, wouldn't it? At some point, you have the freedom to walk away with all of the consequences that brings. And so for Jesus to introduce this boundary between those who know him and those who don't is actually for him to honor our freedom in the kind of relationship we can have with him. That's really important. If that boundary weren't there, what you'd have is Jesus sweeping everyone up, whether they knew it or not, whether they liked it or not, in what he says he has to offer. So, for instance, the religion of Mormonism is well known and often upsets people for baptizing the dead, and sometimes will baptize the dead who, say, died in the Holocaust, causing real offense to Jewish people who think you have no right to do that. I agree with the Jewish people who think that. Wouldn't you? So unless you preserve that boundary, then actually we're not talking about anything meaningful Jesus has come to offer. And if that's a boundary you feel like you're on the wrong side of and you wish you were closer to Jesus, you're in the right place. Talk about that, because that's something we'd love to talk about. But this isn't the kind of boundary, can I say, that's meant to lead to division and hatred. What does Jesus always tell his followers to do? Pray for those who hate you, love your enemies. What were Christians known for in the ancient world? Shamefully, not as known for it now as we ought to have been, but caring for children who would otherwise have been exposed and left to death. looking after those ravaged by plague, even though it meant they would die, caring for the poor. This was how they treated those who weren't Christians. So this boundary between Christian and not is not one from which Christians are supposed to be lobbing hatred and jealousy, but rather across which they ought to be reaching in love. That's why the CU here wants to put on something like Human, so that we can talk about these things, have these questions. Okay, so move on to the second thing. What about someone who grew up in a Christian home? Wouldn't that make it easier for them to become a Christian? Quite possibly. I grew up in a home, well, my parents were very lovely Roman Catholics, but I didn't believe a word of what they told me and walked out on Christianity the first time I had a chance. So I guess in my case it didn't really work like that. And certainly in the secular West, plenty of people have had Christian heritage who don't seem to be particularly espousing it now. Whereas in other parts of the world, those who have had no Christian heritage are rushing to embrace it. Did you know that Christianity is growing rapidly, and in places where there was no kind of Christian heritage? That's quite important too. Ultimately, when we're talking about counterfactuals like, what if I were born here, wouldn't have that made something easier here or there? We have to recognize that those arguments cut both ways. It doesn't make Christianity more or less plausible. If you came from a non-believing home, wouldn't it be easy to be non-believing? Rather, what do you think about the claim of Jesus? In his life, he offers something for absolutely anyone, and he doesn't claim to be interested in those who belong to his tribe or his group. He reaches out to all of us. What do you make of him? Thanks.
So this one is quite specific historically and says, you said that the earliest gospel fragments are from within 40 to 60 years of events, well within living memory. And they say, while comparatively recent compared to Pliny and the other historians, if someone was to write, for example, a biography of Ringo Starr, who was living in the 1970s, if they were writing it 40 years after, isn't that still a bit dodgy historically, essentially?
Great question, thank you. I didn't actually say the fragments were 40 years. I said that the earliest fragments we have date from the mid-2nd century, but that's not when we think those accounts were written. For one thing, the papyrus fragment I showed you was found in Alexandria, and no one thinks that John's Gospel was written there. So you have to account for copying and not translation, but moving things around, and the fact that it must have taken many decades from before then. But yes, the claim that's made by many scholars, actually, not just the most conservative estimate of dates, is that the gospel writings of Jesus were dated somewhere. The earliest ones would be in the 60s, like Mark, and then the latest one, John, sometime perhaps in the 90s latest. Isn't that still a very long period of time? Well, I'd love to point you to a book worth reading by a man called Richard Bauckham, who's a theologian and a very brilliant scholar. It's called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Why that book is worth reading is that he assesses the nature of eyewitness evidence and shows that in oral cultures, you can have a remarkable degree of accuracy in communicating information and in fact, specific form of words across generations. That's what an oral culture can do. And with the Gospels, we're not even talking about being across generations. It's the same generation in which these things are being recounted. So yes, while today, not living in an oral culture, we would find it difficult to think of how that would work, there's no good reason to doubt the way that kind of transmission could have happened then. Also, and it's worth saying, just because these are written a few decades later doesn't mean that everyone stopped thinking about these things, said nothing about it, and then 40 years later picked up a pen. Far from it. You have 40 years of activity in which those who are around Jesus, these eyewitnesses, the technical term seems to be these apostles, are alive and sharing this message and sharing it round. It's as they are leaving the scene that this is no longer good enough, because obviously they're going to die, and their experiences begin to be written down. Now, as I say, even if this were the case, and even if you weren't convinced by that, although I think you should be, the writings of Paul are stunningly early. And as we'll see tomorrow, there are good reasons to go even earlier than Paul's writing, because he records material that he was given by others. That being the case, we're really talking about something like 15 years, which takes us back to 2004, and I can remember what that was like. Maybe you can too, from today. That is definitely not enough of a gap in order to come up with these things. And it's definitely a small enough gap, a tight enough gap, for you to think, I can trust what's being said. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Niv. I think there was a second part of that question, so if you could just briefly chat about this. It said, if God wanted his people to believe in him, why wouldn't he have evidence dating from the day after Jesus died? Why wouldn't he provide us with something more concrete?
A really good question. Why would that be more important? If it was the day after Jesus had died, all sorts of things wouldn't have happened at that point. Go and read an account of his life, and you'll see that there are years in which the implications of what Jesus has done are worked out. Would that actually make it more compelling? If you had evidence from the day after, would you actually believe? If we were having this conversation 200 years ago in maybe the finest theological culture, 19th century Germany or something like that, people would have said in German and with much erudition, well, if it was more, if we had something more concrete like, I don't know, fragments from the 2nd century, or if we really knew we could date John earlier than centuries later, well, now we can. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, if we always shift the goalposts, it's us who's deciding what we think is plausible or not. And that's well and good, but you need to ask yourself, are you really being consistent and honest? Why would that be more convincing than something else? In fact, it seems to me part of the nature of the project of the Gospels that they're telling us about the storyline that happens of Jesus and his life, death, and resurrection, and what happens afterwards. And that's important too. The letters of Paul actually gave me real confidence when I was looking into these things, because they're not propaganda. Paul is not writing to an audience of those who aren't believers. He's writing within a few years to those who are believers. And so when he tells us about things that happened in Jesus' life, he's not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. He's just appealing to something that was known and was believed. I'm blown away by the kind of evidence we do have from the 1st century. It's sui generis. There's nothing like it in the rest of ancient history. Why wouldn't that be good enough? I suppose it wouldn't be good enough if I thought that this kind of extraordinary claim required extraordinary evidence. And I would say this evidence is extraordinary, but then I'd always have the right of saying, not extraordinary enough. And just to move into the second little part, when we ask why didn't God do X to reveal himself, that's an important question, because the way in which God reveals himself tells you something about what he's like. Why doesn't God just write my name on the moon to reveal himself to me? Why doesn't God just levitate all of you right now to prove himself to me? It's not that Christians don't think God could do those things, but it's just that those things wouldn't at all reveal him to be the kind of God he's shown himself to be. By revealing himself in Jesus, God shows you what he wants to know about you. This amazing life in all of its beauty and quality. The way he's able to make a difference. I hope you're coming along in the evenings and hearing these moments in Jesus' life and the difference that he's able to make in that situation. No, maybe you weren't there, but you get to know all about it from the evidence you look at, the same way you know about anything in history. And more to the point, this is the kind of revelation of God that communicates who he actually is. I hope you understand, God is not just interested in proving to you that he exists. What a strange thing that would be. He's interested in knowing you and you knowing him, in drawing you to know him in Jesus and showing you the lengths he would go to in his love for you. That's a very different thing. And it requires a very different kind of revelation than just what you or I consider most plausible right now. Just finally, can I say that our cultural baggage shapes what we think is plausible. Do you know, in the first couple of centuries after the Christian faith, one of the strongest arguments was, you're too recent. Real thought is where antiquity was. That's how you know something's plausible. It's just really, really old. And so these early Christian defenders had to say things like, Moses is where Plato got his thinking from. And Moses tells you that Jesus is coming, and therefore Jesus is trustworthy. That's not a line of argument I'm taking with any of you, because none of us would find it particularly plausible. But you see the problems. If you say, no, I want the proof to look like this, without accounting for the fact that your cultural baggage has shaped how you'd want it to look, then that would mean that you're asking God to do all sorts of bizarre things that wouldn't speak to most people in history. And he's interested in speaking to most people in history. He's interested in how this life lived out in a particular time can impact your life lived out now. And he's made it possible for you to have the kind of evidence that gives you real access to that life. That's worth digging into. Thanks.
Thanks, Niv. We've got time for one more question, but before that, just want to emphasize that the cafe, ice cream, this hall will be open from 2 till 6. Stay, chat, study. We just really welcome you to use the space for the afternoon. Right, okay, so last question. What did Jesus expect from his followers? And sort of linked question, what led him to pursue the path of martyrdom?
Great question. What did Jesus expect from his followers? What led him to pursue martyrdom, the path of martyrdom? He doesn't appear to have expected too much from his followers at certain moments. He's not surprised by the fact that they let him down, and he doesn't hold it against them. One of the most moving things you find is that even after Peter has betrayed Jesus, when Jesus dies, after his resurrection, Peter is one of the first people Jesus wants to know and talk to again. So while he seems to have expected his disciples to go wrong in all sorts of ways, which is something that gives Christians today a lot of encouragement to know that we're not expected to be perfect, we see that real dynamic and understanding. At the same time, Jesus is calling them to follow him and to embrace the way of life he himself followed. And in one of the pivotal moments in Mark's gospel, he calls everyone to follow the path he's taking to his death. And he doesn't mean physical death, although for that first generation of Christians, and for many even around the world today, it has meant physical death, to stand by the claims of Jesus even while others tell you not to. What he's calling them to is a life of self-denial. Now that does not sound particularly encouraging, self-denial, and yet what Jesus says, unpicking the way we think through some really searching paradoxes, is only through self-denial will we ever actually be fulfilled. Because we live in the kind of world where things do go wrong. And that's why he asked that question, what would someone gain if they gained everything in the world and forfeited their soul? He's saying in the light of eternity, what looks like self-denial now is the wisest route to fulfillment and to joy. And that's been the experience of many Christians. I didn't quote him all of today, so let me quote him today. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Screwtape Letters, in which he pretends to be a devil, as you do. And as this devil, he writes to a junior devil who's tempting someone, and he talks about God, and he says, "Don't be deceived. For all the stakes and crosses and fasts and vigils, they're just like foam on the seashore. Out in the sea of his pleasure, there is more and more joy." Sorry, I butchered that quote. But the point he's making is that what God boasts of is pleasures at his right hand forevermore. And that is exactly what Jesus says is on offer. And self-denial is the facade of that. But as you come through it, that's what you discover. So what motivated Jesus to pursue that path of martyrdom? Ultimately, there are many ways to answer that question. Ultimately, love. Love for God, because it appears to have been something Jesus insisted on, that he must die. And looking at these Gospels, it's clear that he thinks he must die because this is part of a divine plan, a plan that is going to cost Jesus everything, and yet one which he must fulfill because he loves the Father. And that's what he says, that everyone will know that I love the Father. Secondly, love for us. Love for his disciples, even though they got it wrong so many times. The kind of love that thought, I don't want you to face a right judgment. I don't want you to face justice for the things that you've done wrong. But here's the thing, Jesus doesn't want to be less than fair. He wants to be more than fair. And so the death he chooses to die is the kind of death in which he promises to pay the debts of our moral wrongdoing, if you like. He aims to take our place. This is all over the language of the Bible, that Jesus is dying for our sins. That's technical terms to tell us that, not technological, sorry. These are technical terms to describe that Jesus believes that in this death, he's making the kind of life with God that is enriching and full possible, despite the fact that we've turned away from him, despite the fact that we have lived life in our own way. That's what led him there. That in this death, he would show his love for God, the Father, and his love for us by doing something for us that enabled us to have life. And he was willing to die for that. Thanks.